humans are emotional animals and not logical animals.
We're both. Logic is influenced by our emotions far more than we think or than we wish it is.
Dr. Zoe Chance is a professor at Yale School of Management, published author, researcher, and expert in behavioral science. She is the author of Influence, Your Superpower, which explores the art of persuasion and its impact on creating positive change.
What is your favorite student challenge from the most popular course at Yale that you teach?
This course that I teach is called Mastering Influence and Persuasion, and it is designed to push people out of their comfort zone so that we can expand our comfort zone, be more audacious, courageous, and have more influence. Probably my favorite influence challenge has been this game that we play called Bigger and Better, where you start with a paperclip, you trade up for something bigger and better, and then the next week you come back to class and you bring your biggest, best thing. You can trade with anybody. Bigger and better could be conceptual, could be physical. But the most shocking outcome of this game was some students, Manus and Tom, who showed up 1 week later and they said, actually, Zoe, we couldn't fit the thing into the classroom. So could you bring our class outside? So we got to the front of the building. There is a Volkswagen Jetta sitting in the turnaround. It says bigger and better across the windshield. They donated it to a refugee family from Afghanistan. The mom was commuting 2 hours each way on the bus every day. So all of us love to be part of this happy story. And they were willing to call every car dealership in our home state of Connecticut. They only had to call one.
Hmm.
So this story illustrates how much we could be dreaming bigger and better and having more of an influence, and how influence can help others in addition to us. And it's the kind of superpower that we can all develop.
I feel like the undercurrent of your response, though, is superpower is usually valid when you're helping others with it. And I think in 2024, a lot of people live in this gloom and doom, very bleak landscape. They feel like altruism has died, humanity is dying. So, why do you feel like not losing hope? Just with your case study and your example, they didn't only master and exceeded the expectations, but they gave their car away for free.
That's right. What people find when they start practicing asking for more, they also practice in another challenge, trying to get rejected. We do cold calling, which is really scary, negotiations, so many different fun and scary things. But overall, people are 2 or 3 times more likely to say yes than we think that they would be.
Hmm.
And this means people are a lot nicer than we think they would be. And also, another piece of research I love is that we are 12% more likable than we think. And this is from a series of studies by Vanessa Bonds at Cornell. And she finds that when we meet someone like you and like I got to finally meet you today, and I really like you, but you don't know how much or whether I like you because you can only feel whether or how much you like me.
Hmm.
But I feel like, oh, you must know that I really like you because I already liked you before we met and we went to the same school and you've talked to my close friends and they really liked you. Right. So, on average, everyone listening, you're 12% more likable and charming than you know.
Hmm. 12% is a pretty significant percentage.
Yeah, it's not small, right?
Yeah. I think so this morning I'm a 5 a.m. morning goer, a gym goer, and I literally saw this person running like 5:45 a.m. You can tell he was doing his programming, and I think he saw a key on the ground where he was walking by, and he stopped while he was in full sprinting mode, and he went to like 4 or 5 people who was cleaning the streets to ask if it was their key. And if you know anything about running, you don't want to stop your momentum, especially if it's part of your programming. But it's interesting that you say that starting this conversation with superpower, with that altruistic element, and me just seeing this person stopping and just voluntarily giving away his time and stopping what he's doing for the sake of finding the right person that belongs to his key.
Yeah, people really, there are so many really, really nice people, the majority of people. And it's just that there are some big jerks who are very memorable that take up an outsized space in our mental schema compared to what they deserve.
Hmm. So speaking of jerks and good people, I think it comes down to the topic of heart. or minds. So, Zoe, why is winning hearts or appealing to the emotions more important than changing the minds?
It might be more important to change somebody's mind to you in a specific situation,
Mm,
but our minds have less influence on our behavior than our conscious mind has less influence than our unconscious mind, and our unconscious mind includes our emotions. We can't control our emotions. We're having these visceral responses.
mm,
And I think it's easy to put ourselves into a situation where we can imagine how little influence our conscious intentions have. If you think of New Year's resolutions, for example, we come up with New Year's resolutions because we haven't been able to influence ourselves to do the things that we know are important. We don't
mm.
need to change our mind. We just want to influence our behavior. And so this book that I have and everything that I teach and write about is about how to influence people's behavior, which is usually what we want to do, even if what we're imagining is that we want to change their mind.
In the clinical work, the most important thing that we do is behavior gap analysis because behavior patterns do not lie. I work with comorbidities, so forensic population, and words lies, right? I'm not saying they lied in the moment. They might have meant it in the moment, but then there's a gap between what they're saying and what they're doing. So I think I always encourage my patients to come down to your behavior patterns. So back to you. Can you debunk once and for all why humans are emotional animals and not logical animals, as many people like to believe?
We're both. It's just that logic is influenced by our emotions
Mm,
far more than we think or than we wish it is. And we don't always have the mental faculties available for logical thinking. Anytime we are under stress or time pressure, or we don't have sleep, or we're hungry, in any state of depletion, wherever the depletion comes from, we don't have so much bandwidth to be carefully, rationally, objectively analyzing. And that's when we especially have a lot of influence from it's not just emotions, but our habitual behavior and our biases.
mm.
And I'd love to hear about the behavior gap analyses that you do with your clients at any point in this conversation. I would love to learn from you about that.
Yeah, it's very simple. It's just anytime they come back with their goals. You talked about New Year resolutions. Man, staggeringly high number of statistics shows that most New Year resolutions fail, and that's why I think intention is more important than resolutions. You talked about implementation's intention, right?
Mm.
And so it's the same thing when a patient comes tells me that, hey, I'm working on this. I want to enter rehab. I want to quit substances, whatever they are. But then they relapse, or as soon as they leave my sessions, they're engaging in whatever dosage they're using. So when they come back, I just say, hey, you told me you want to maintain or seek sobriety, but you're doing X, Y, and Z. Can you help me understand? Are you trying to work on your sobriety, or are you just saying that in the moment because it feels good? It's self gratifying. And it's a very non pathological approach because, as you said, emotions are complex and there's so many factors that's influencing our decisions day to day.
And so you're asking essentially what I'm hearing is you're asking, what are you doing, if anything, to work toward that goal that you say that you have? And I love hearing the tone of voice as well in which you have this conversation because there's no judgment there.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, we'll talk about the tonality down the line because you talk about that in your
Okay.
podcast, in your book. So I do want to go into biases since you brought that up, right? I think biases are huge, or cognitive biases in this case. One thing that a lot of people don't know is cognitive biases are innate to a lot of us, and you can't quite eradicate or delete them entirely, but rather you can learn to manage, just like stress. Goal of life isn't to eliminate stress. I tell my patients the only people who are not stressed are dead people, right? So, so it's all about distress management. And likewise, I think it's the same token for biases. So, can you share something about effective ways in your line of work, research, or in your book that can effectively allow someone to get more aware of their biases and actually work on that eventually?
The relevant study that pops up when you're talking about biases, and also because you're talking about the population of people that you work with, is a study that I describe in my book, which was looking at how judges make parole decisions
Mm,
and the external influences on these decisions. And this is where depletion comes in. So, what the study found was in 1,100 parole decisions where there was this very strong pattern between time of day and the outcome of that decision. At the beginning of the day, where judges had a lot of mental bandwidth to be processing the information they're getting about each potential parolee, the parolees had about a two-thirds, they're not a parolee yet, prisoners, incarcerated people had a two-thirds chance of getting out on parole.
mm,
And then that number goes down, down, down. There's a spike up to about two-thirds, down, down, down again, essentially to zero, another spike, and declines to about zero at the end of the day. And what it turned out, as people who are listening might imagine, is that the reason for the spikes is just that the judges got an opportunity for a meal break
mhm,
and to clear their mind. And it's not necessarily that these judges are socially biased in a specific way, although you can look up research and find judges are human, prejudiced in the same ways the rest of us are. But the way I interpret the study is that their logical decision making is being biased by the visceral responses that come from not having the bandwidth. And typically what the biggest factor in our decisions is I'll do what's easy. So I'll do what's logistically easy or I'll do what's cognitively easy. And in this case, this person committed a crime. That's why they're in prison. The easy decision is keep them in prison.
mm.
It's a harder decision to let them out on parole. So, and I've gotten actually last week, I got an email from a judge in Brazil who said, "Thank you so much for sharing this study in your book. And I relate to this completely." So, this is a very small thing that we can do when we feel ourselves getting mentally taxed and we're being biased toward the people that we're having to make decisions about, is we just need to take more breaks and we need to step away. And anytime, like I know you've been a teacher and I've been a teacher, when we're doing something like grading or when you're recruiting and going through resumes, just randomize the order in which you're doing this so that so that you're not giving people privilege and penalties just according to, say, the order of their last name or something silly like that.
That's so true. I mean, I haven't taught in a long time, but I used to be a teacher through Teach for America. And I haven't thought about this in so many years, but I remember, you subconsciously recognize the A students in your classes. And as soon as I see their name, I would actually gloss through their papers or projects faster while giving them the same A. And it's like a preservation techniques that our subconscious uses, right? But it's so interesting because if judges, some of the most rigorously and intellectually trained professionals struggle with this, what does this say about the everyday folks?
It's universal.
Yeah. And I think awareness is the first step, right? Yeah. So let's go into some of the misconceptions that you really highlight and try to debunk in your book. Your book is truly like the culmination of so many researches and topics. One thing that really stood out to me, Zoe, from your book is what is the mother of all misunderstanding, and why is this especially important in 2024? Your book came out a couple years back, but I think that is even more prevalent now.
And I'd like to ask you why about that. But this mother of misconceptions is what we've been talking about, that we imagine ourselves to be logical people when we are really much more emotional, habitual people who are making gut decisions and then rationalizing them rather than being rational and objective. The problem when we're trying to influence other people is that this is actually a bigger cost for those of us who are kind and who are smart.
Mm.
And certainly the smart part applies to listeners of your podcast. I don't know if they're kind, but you are. So I hope that they are too. What we don't want to be manipulating other people. We want to just give them the information so that they can make the best decision. But if we're just giving them the information, we're not understanding how that decision process really works, which is that the information is processed through the lens of this unconscious piece that's visceral, emotional, habitual, and essentially lazy and makes very quick decisions.
Mm,
So if we didn't have, for example, the other person being interested, open minded, probably liking us, feeling curious before we gave them the pile of facts, then they'll process that pile of facts. It's like the opposite of the A student you just talked about. A student who you have known to be kind of lazy in the past.
mhm,
You're probably just skim through their paper similarly, like, I don't think they're going to do well on this one either. So other people will be biased always for us or against us when they process the information and facts we give them. And the art of influence is trying to have them be biased in our favor.
mm. It's almost like you're hijacking and working with the systems that's been established for eons, like Daniel Kahneman System 1, System 2. But then you're switching the table so it serves you rather than disserving you.
Yes. And system one and system two, for people who are familiar with it, that's exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about the visceral, quick reactions and the slow, logical information processing. My background, too, is in behavioral economics. And Daniel Kahneman actually was the postdoctoral advisor and is still a close
Mm,
collaborator of my baby daddy. I'm a huge fan of his and his work.
yeah, it's his book came out in 2002, I believe, but then it's even more influential now, pun intended with the influence. I want to go quickly into this misconception to my knowledge. Where a lot of people believe that, generally speaking, higher the intellect point or IQ or processing power you have, the more objective they are. What I learned is smarter people are actually better at self rationalizing their irrational beliefs. Can you elaborate on that?
I'll share something personal that I've been thinking about a lot recently, um, which is that I spent a lot of my doctoral studies studying self deception
Mm,
and cognitive biases with two researchers who have now been accused of research fraud.
mm,
And they were doing some of this research finding that people who are more intelligent and people who are more creative rationalize better than the rest of us. And now they've been accused of essentially doing this. So this is a personally interesting, upsetting, and important kind of query. And now I'm asking myself, yeah, is that what they were doing while they were doing this work? I my understanding of this research, based on mine and theirs and everything that I've read, is that people who are, you call them higher IQ, um, sometimes we'll call it higher need for cognition.
mm,
They're related. They're not exactly the same. The outcomes are the same on a lot of cognitive tests. It's that some of us have more need than other people to be explaining and understanding the world to ourselves. And if we have that need that we really need to explain and understand the world, we still have all the same biases as everyone else, but they're maybe kicked into a higher gear if we have this additional need to explain to ourselves. That's additional motivation to rationalize.
mm.
And we can be creative, and tell ourselves all kinds of stories. And later, if you want, I can mention some work, and experiences related to self deception and influence. And I think self deception is a very big problem when we're talking about trying to be influential.
I was literally going to ask you about the science of self deception. I'm going to table that because I want to ask this question that just popped up. Is that the need for cognition? Because I think I definitely fall into that category, like the split thinkers and feelers, even though we're all both. It's just a spectrum. Does that have any relationship with meaning making or our propensity to make meanings? Since not everyone does that, but I'm definitely a meaning making being.
So I would say, Benoit, I have definitely the same theory of mind that you do, that these are related. But because we're getting nerdy on academic research, I don't know that there's research drawing a direct connection between those two things. But my hypothesis would be the same as yours.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the most empowering thing that I believe in, I'm a Christian by faith, but I dabble in like Stoic philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, is I believe that life is inherently meaningless. But I feel empowered by that because that gives us the avenue and entry points to make meanings and interpret what happens to us through the sequence of life in a way that's serving us, like your approach with biases. Let's accept that there are biases and let's accept that certain things have no meaning per my perspective, but we can do something about it. And that's the ownership I sense.
Benoit, this is so deep, and I want to make sure that I understand what you just said because I'm going to take it with me and ponder it. You believe that there's no empirical meaning that exists in life, but I'm also hearing you say that we want to experience and feel meaning in life. And so if life itself isn't where the meaning comes from, and we're where the meaning comes from, then we get to be the architect of the meaning in life.
Exactly right.
I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Viktor Frankl. He talked about pursuing meaning is the highest purpose of life. And whenever people are like, oh, what's the meaning of life? I don't know. But I think the meaning of life is seeking a meaning in life. And at least that's the way I operate my life around.
Yeah, and I've never heard anyone use that frame of life is essentially meaningless, and that's empowering. Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, is such a wonderful book. And I just led a book club discussion with some students on this book. Anyone who's listening who hasn't read this book, it's just incredibly, incredibly profoundly inspiring. And he wrote this and developed this whole psychological theory and practice after being imprisoned in during the Holocaust in I think it was Germany, although it might have been Poland.
Yeah, harrowing
Yeah.
experience, but it's like Mandela, right? All these greats, they have the ability to tap into post traumatic growth, really
Mhm.
internalize and adapt, and even leveling up from the traumatic experiences you go through. So let's go into the science of self deceptions because Viktor Frankl is the opposite of that. He's radically honest with his self. So, what is the science of self deception, and why do so many people choose to lie to themselves, like your former colleagues or otherwise?
So, by the way, about my former colleagues, I don't know what their mental
Mm,
processes were, and I also don't know if they were doing the fraud that they've been accused of,
mm,
right? So this is an accusation,
mhm,
and there's a lawsuit going on and things like that. But what is interesting to me about self-deception is that the process of meaning making that you're describing is very often a motivated process
mm,
where we there's no way to not have a perspective when we're seeing the world, and there's also no way to not have a perspective when we're seeing ourselves. So the majority of us are motivated to see ourselves in a perhaps biased kind of positive light. People who are depressed, which is also a huge chunk of us, see themselves more realistically. People who are not depressed tend to see themselves as perhaps better than we are on all different kinds of dimensions, objective and subjective. But we also just have this very strong need to try to see ourselves positively. And so when we are either doing something that might be not so great or maybe even unethical, or we're making that decision, when our incentives are aligned with doing something that will benefit us, then these mental processes of self deception and meaning making can kick in to try to make an excuse for us. And a lot of times we will be asked to try to influence people, or we'll be asking ourselves to try to influence people in a way that's ultimately selfish.
mm,
And our brains are really great at justifying all kinds of reasons to do that. A very simple situation is just almost everyone who's worked in sales for
Mm,
very long has had to sell something that they just didn't believe in, or had to try to sell something that they did believe in to someone that they didn't think really should should be wanting this thing. And I have some experience in sales, not a ton of it, but I've gotten to experience that cognitive dissonance of, okay, I'm making the excuse to myself of why this kind of thing is okay. And we need to deceive ourselves to influence other people in a situation like that because our own personal enthusiasm and our own personal authenticity is so influential.
mm.
Benoit, I don't know if you've ever heard or read this, but I find it very interesting that college cheerleaders get recruited in a very formal process into influence roles like pharmaceutical sales reps. There are consulting companies that do recruiting into sales roles specifically of college cheerleaders because those people are trained to manufacture and spark enthusiasm in other people.
Never heard that. I just thought about the Netflix special Cheer, but I knew about their greediness and how competitive it is. But makes sense because they are in literally in the role of influence or igniting excitement, like you said. So
Right.
that's very cool. Okay, so speaking of a game of influence, let's talk about the questions I wanted to ask earlier. So can you, in whatever way you see fit, why isn't the game of influence like zero sum or win lose orientated as many people think? And that might be a scarcity mindset, and that might be just a bad reputation from snake oil salesmen or business as a whole. But why can everyone win in this game of influence?
Actually, I don't think it's a binary question. And I know you don't mean it in this way of is it win lose or is it win win? Because of course it depends on the context and on the situation. There will once in a while be a transaction where, let's say, you are going to buy or not buy socks from me and you're never going to see me again. And you know this because we're in a remote village in another country and you don't think you're ever going to come back. And we're haggling over the price of the socks. And, we can have a feel good or not feel good vibe that is there for us then and afterward. But it's really a transactional thing where if you pay more money, then, I have more money, but you have less money. If you pay less money, you have more and I have less. But there are very few influence situations where that's all that is at stake. And so often, what's really at stake is things that we don't even see, like the possibility of future relationships. So, what I'm coaching people very often to do when they have an opportunity or when they have a negotiation is to think bigger and more creatively. Like, how could this benefit me even more? I always want you to be happy, right? How could this benefit the other party even more? And also, why would I be sad about that? I should be very happy about that. And then, who else could possibly benefit from this situation? What other opportunities would there be? I could share, if you want, just a brief situation where I had a conversation like this at Yale talking about research.
Yes, please.
So when I was first hired into the role that I have now on the Yale faculty doing behavioral science, I was invited to negotiate with the dean to get an employee to run a research lab. And I was asked to negotiate an employee salary at a kind of median staff level. So fine, no problem. But instead, what I decided to do was think big picture. What would it look like in a perfect world to have a world class behavioral lab for this person to manage? And how could it be better for my colleagues? How could it be better for the students that we work with? How could it be better for the participants? How could it be better for the school recruiting? And so, where I could have just had one conversation with the dean, I actually had probably 20 conversations with people at other universities who are running research labs to find out what does it take to have a world class research lab And then I got to go and pitch a whole proposal for a world class research lab funded by the school that included better funding for participants who would come and be part of it, and also funding for faculty who could be doing research in this. And what ended up with what might have been like, I don't know, a $50,000 job that I would have been pitching for turned into a $2 million program
Wow.
that I was pitching for. And this was many years ago now, that since I joined the faculty, and we still have a thriving behavioral research lab. So it's not that that couldn't have happened somehow without me, because it's good for everybody. But this is the kind of thing that when we just take the menu that life offers us and say, do I want that thing? Yes or no? We could be doing everyone a disservice rather than just doing ourselves a disservice. Also, a lot of times, if you just look at the menu as yes or no, the answer is no, when a little bit of tweaking or creativity could have turned the answer to yes.
My question was a trap because nuances is the central theme of the podcast. So sometimes I ask black and white questions to see where the guest takes, but you survived the trap. So um, that reminds me of something I just told a mentee a few weeks ago. He is in a phase in career where he's trying to navigate opportunities versus opportunity cost. And he was almost getting paralyzed, right? I don't like the word paralysis by analysis. But I told him, his name is Josh. I was like, hey, Josh, a lot of people think that opportunities demand actions. They got it backwards. Actions create opportunities. And
Mm.
because in order to incite momentum, you have to take some action. And inaction is the biggest opportunity cost. And I sense that in what you just said.
It's a great frame. Thank you.
Yeah. And
And also, I can tell you're a great coach.
well, I mean, I am a therapist by trade, I guess. And another useful resource is the book called Infinity Game by Simon Sinek, the author of Power of Why. He talks about exactly the thesis of what you just said. It is possible to live in a scenario where and win is possible, but you have to first challenge the status quo of this win-lose scenario that you started the response with.
Thank you. By the way, on the topic of influence that we're talking about and this particular book. So I'm a huge fan of Simon Sinek as
Mhm.
a writer and as a speaker and as a person. And this book was surprising to me that he wrote it, because he wrote it based on a book that had been written, I think, in the 50s, called Finite and Infinite Games. I don't know if you've read it, looks like maybe you have. And the whole idea of the infinite game, Simon Sinek's work, was already covered by this book that very few people had read. And Simon Sinek acknowledges where this idea and this book came from. He's not secretive about it or stealing their work or anything. But it really changed how I think about influence, actually, to have read this book, because I didn't know that I was undervaluing the importance of sharing stories and sharing the work that we do, where the work had already been done writing this book of finite and infinite games, but it was not a popular book and it was decades old. So nobody was reading it. And this book was having no influence almost until this really fantastic writer and speaker with a great platform, wide followership, takes this idea and expands it. And of course, he has all kinds of new and interesting and concrete stories that are modern and historic. It's a very pleasurable book to read. And I want to just share one of the messages that I share with my students is, when you want to be influential, don't task yourself with creativity and having to reinvent the wheel.
Mm.
So you can start with what other people have already done, and don't feel like you need to be this groundbreaking, super creative person. If what you want is influence and to make a difference, don't worry about innovation as much as spreading the word and amplifying.
Yeah, I'm reading this book called Read, Write, Own by Chris Dixon. It's part of my book club, actually. I also have a book club every week. It's funny you brought up your book club discussion earlier. But pretty much the thesis is, and it's this sort of adjacent to Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1. And as you know, more than anyone, that there's two main avenues of opportunities in entrepreneurship. First one is what most people do, refine and improve the existing product. The second one is 0 to 1, going from nothing to something. And I think too many people get caught up in the latter one, even though more opportunities is in, as you said, don't reinvent the wheel. Make that wheel a little bit shinier, a little bit faster, a little bit more durable.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely feel too many people are trying to go from 0 to 1. Too many people are trying to start their own enterprise instead of joining and collaborating with something that's already going well, especially in nonprofits. In the world of foundations, people feel like I have to have my own foundation. And there's so much wasted time and energy. And then also, all of us and all these different organizations competing for attention and resources where we could just collaborate. I had a conversation with someone who was running for mayor in my town where it was very telling. And I asked him, if you don't get elected as mayor, what are you going to do? And none of his answers had to do with public service in our town.
Mm.
And I just felt like if you're not committed to public service in our town, whether or not you become mayor, I'm going to vote for anyone else to become mayor before I vote for you.
Yeah, I think the undercurrent of that is like, yes, saying yes to the right opportunities, but also saying no to the misaligned opportunities. Um, one of my most one of my favorite case studies from your book is the most powerful no in human history. Can you elaborate? So, what is the most powerful no in human history that prevented most likely World War III?
Sure, Benoit. This is the no that saved the world. And it's a story that not a lot of people know, but anyone can search more information online, and there's a documentary about it. This was in the 1980s. Stanislav Petrov was a Russian military officer. He was working in an IT center in Moscow, where this center was doing military surveillance. And the worst thing that could possibly happen, and what they were trained to watch out for, was an invasion, and in particular, missiles coming from the United States to the USSR. One morning, early in the morning, their relatively new IT system is detecting 5 missiles coming from the US to Russia. And they have a short period of time in which they can respond militarily. If they respond militarily, this is absolutely the beginning of World War III. And if World War III happens, projections are that 2 billion people on this planet will die, in addition to the indirect problems for all life on Earth. Stanislav Petrov, because of his background in IT and the system is new, even though he's in the military where there's a very strong hierarchy and you know that you have to report up the chain of command because that's your job and you're risking your job if you don't do this, rather than pick up the phone and call his superiors, he decides to say no to his job, say his responsibility, and all of the people working for him in this unit. He locks the door and he believes that probably this is a glitch in the system and those missiles are not real. He's tried to confirm with the visual detection system, are these missiles really coming? But there's too much cloud cover.
Mm.
They can't confirm one way or another. And so he's taking responsibility for allowing an invasion of Russia to happen if these are real missiles, and it will be too late to respond if he is wrong. It's the biggest risk that any of us could imagine taking. Thank God he did, because he was right. It was a glitch in the system. There were no 5 missiles, but he had to take responsibility for the future of the world in this 20-minute period until the missiles would have hit. He was fired the next year, asked to step down for undisclosed reasons. He did not live out his life as a hero in Russia,
Mm.
but he did win a I forgot what this prize was, but a few years before he died maybe about 10 years ago at this point, and he won a Savior of Humanity prize, and there's a beautiful documentary. But when you watch the documentary, you'll see he doesn't feel like a hero. He just did the thing that was seemed like the right thing at the time. And that's something I find very interesting when reading stories and hearing from people who have done heroic acts. It almost never felt like a heroic act at the time, and for most of them, it doesn't feel like that afterward. It was just that they had the visceral, immediate, unconscious system 1 reaction of, "This is the right thing to do."
And that's a full circle with the way we started this conversation, emotions versus logic. Like if your operational point is skewed because of the emotions, the panicking state, the high pressure of the world literally being on your shoulder. And I think he's like the master example of what happens and the possibilities when you're able to master your emotions. Aside from the crazy story, and I'm surprised he didn't win Nobel Peace Prize retroactively.
Yeah, somebody like that could and absolutely should. He said that it was very important and relevant that he had a civilian background rather than a military
Mm,
background. And this is relevant for the System 1, System 2 distinction because not having a military background meant he didn't have as much practice with military procedure that would just kick in as an automatic response as all of the other people in roles like his at this time had all come through the military. But because he came from a civilian background, he got to be have the experience of having second guessed his superiors in other contexts and having the responsibility to be thinking for himself and not just following the orders that he was supposed to follow.
mm. One of the,
I,
oh, go ahead.
I'm just curious
The lights.
if there's anything about your military background that comes up or relates to this situation that we're talking about.
Saying no is not an option in the military for sure.
Mm,
And it does prime you that way. And it speaks like conditioning, right? But just like I talked about meaning making and meaninglessness of life per my perspective, that because there's conditioning, I see equal empowerment in the hopes with deconditioning, which is what a lot of my clinical work's about. But yeah, conditioning is very powerful and it makes it even harder when you have dissonance. And I actually was going to ask you about dissonance. We brought up earlier, but can you briefly define what are cognitive dissonances? Because that's the in between space with system 1 and system 2, but also conflicting ideas. But what are they and why is it an important concept?
sure. Cognitive dissonance essentially boils down to believing something different from what we're doing. And it's very uncomfortable. And we have this innate need to try to resolve it. And so, what that means is we have to change our beliefs or we have to change our actions. And if our incentives are not aligned with changing our actions, then this is where self deception comes in, where we're trying to change our beliefs. There are so many situations that cognitive dissonance comes up and is important, but very, very often when we're experiencing it, we're not realizing it
Mhm.
because of the self deception. So the outcome of cognitive dissonance is self deception, and that prevents us from acknowledging or understanding or observing the cognitive dissonance that's going on. I have a small story to share from industry where I was asked at one point. So I used to work in industry and I was in consumer marketing. And I was asked by somebody in a very large corporation I worked in, and this person was at a very high level. I was asked to tell a giant lie. I was asked to tell a $20 million lie
Wow.
to the CEOs of some other companies. And it had to do with our marketing plan and saying that we were going to TV advertise a product that we didn't plan to advertise at all. And I felt so uncomfortable. And I would like to say I was too good a person to tell this lie, but it was actually just it wasn't that I was too good a person, it was that was too bad a liar,
Mm,
and I knew that I was not gonna be able to do it. I just wasn't gonna be able to have these words come out of my mouth without being really obvious about it. And I was very junior at this time, and I was just trying to navigate the morals of the world and business and trying to understand. And I just said, "I'm sorry, I can't do it." I thought I might be fired. I wasn't fired. And this very senior person, when we had all, it was an entire week of Every single brand and product manager is pitching the whole entire week to CEOs of all these other companies who come in. I had to do 20 of these pitches during the week. And this guy says, "Oh, you're so adorable. You're so green and naive and you're adorable, Zoe. Don't worry about it. I'll come in at that part of your pitch." So he came in and told the whopper lie 20 times during this week. And what he said was, it's not what you don't understand, Zoe, is that it's not a lie if it hasn't happened yet.
Hmm.
And he truly believed this. So in his mind, it's not a lie that we're going to spend $20 million on something we have no plan to spend $20 million on, because anything could happen between now and then. And so this is how he's deceiving himself to be able to lie about any kind of plan that we can ever have, where to him, it's just literally not a lie. So that's how he resolved the cognitive dissonance, is changing his beliefs. How I resolved the cognitive dissonance was changing my actions. So these are the two paths.
This is a random question, but speaking of industry, I just thought about the saying, fake it till you make it. Because that's what he's doing in a very conscientious and knowing way. But can you, I just want to keep this wide open. It's a wide question. But given your experiences in the industry, right? I mean, you did used to manage like $200 million worth of the sections at the Barbie, and now you're in the academic space. But what are your thoughts on the most trope saying in the marketing or business? Fake it until you make it.
I hate it. I hate it. And also, I really, really hate it that where this seems to have the most traction and the biggest impact is in startups
Mm.
and entrepreneurs, venture capital. I had a venture capitalist in my class who this year earlier was having a conversation where he said, You know, all these people say that when an entrepreneur is pitching to a VC, that we make decisions in 2 minutes about which projects we're going to fund or not." He was like, "That's total bullshit. It's 2 seconds." And this idea of fake it till you make it has somehow, for some reason, been actively embraced by venture capitalists who really highly and unwisely value storytelling and enthusiasm. This comes back to the cheerleading
Mm.
that we were talking about. And so what happens is, let's say you're pitching your own startup. If you are realistic about the risks, if you're realistic about the possibilities that your startup won't succeed, and you were to go and share with someone who's considering funding this idea, listen, here's the beautiful big picture world of possibilities. And then here's also the reality of there's a very, very large chance that this is going to fail spectacularly or to some degree. You're not going to get funded. And so, this fake it till you make it, like literally every single startup pitch that I see, and I love startups and working with entrepreneurs and innovation, but I would say every single startup pitch that I see has some element of this, and it's not their fault. Founders are forced to do this.
Because that's the game they're playing.
Yeah, but why?
I I couldn't tell you.
I mean, human, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's almost like if everyone else is inflating whatever they have, and if you're not inflating whatever you have, then naturally it becomes an uneven playing field. So like how do we
That's
equalize
right.
that, you know? Like how do we equalize or revert back to non-inflated state? I don't know.
Yeah. And if anyone is interested in reading a book on this topic that's really good, oh my gosh, the title is escaping me, but it's about the founder of WeWork
Hmm.
and investor Big Kahuna at SoftBank. And they talk in detail about this. But WeWork founder is just such a strong example of fake it till you make it. And then there's also a hilarious Netflix documentary. It's called Fire, or it's about this fire conference. It's FYRE,
The
and
festival,
it's
yes.
the fire festival. Yeah, and it's somebody who was trying to fake it until he made it, but he never got into the make it stage. It was just the fake it stage, and it's very funny. And if you enjoy, if you have Schadenfreude, as an emotional experience that you enjoy, you will feel that when you watch this.
And even with WeWork, I think they declared bankruptcy a while ago, or they're near bankruptcy. I know Uber for the first time this year made was profitable for the first time. So I feel like there is karma, cosmically or not, it does come back. Another pronounced example, I forgot her name. She was like the female Steve Jobs. She had the highest evaluation for her project of human cells and things like that. But then it turned out it was a total fraud.
Elizabeth
Elizabeth
Holmes,
Holmes, yes.
she was only faking it and temporarily making it.
Yeah. But when she made it, it was at the peak. But when she fell, it was also at the peak.
That's right.
This is a natural segue to this question. What are some of the most important red flags to spotting a con artist or manipulations from a mile away?
Mm. So many people think that we can spot liars. And I even implied earlier in the conversation that I didn't want to tell this lie because there were going to be all of these cues that would tell people that I was a liar. We are terrible at lie detection,
Mhm.
and this includes police and this includes parents. The reason that we think that we're good at lie detection is because what we can perceive is when people are uncomfortable.
Mm.
And people who are not very practiced at lying are often not comfortable with their lies. And so they do display cues of discomfort. However, people who are practiced liars are very comfortable and they don't display any of those cues. And the cues would be, whatever you could imagine, like looking away, like nervous fidgeting, like stumbling over our words, giving too much information. These are just cues of discomfort, and people can be very uncomfortable when they're honest as well as when they're dishonest. So there are all kinds of reasons for being uncomfortable. Some of the cues that we can look for spotting con artists will be the this is not just con artists, but people who are trying to influence you in a selfish way are especially people who put time pressure on you.
Mm.
Because when you have time pressure, then you get put in the situation like the judges were in, where you don't have bandwidth. You need to make an immediate decision and you're in system 1 processing mode. You're very heavily dominated by your emotions. And this is another thing that selfish influencers and con artists will do is give you an intensely emotional experience to put you in that processing mode. So the emotions really could be anything. The emotion could be fear, it could be anger, it could be spiritual ecstasy, it could be sexual arousal. The emotion can be absolutely anything. And what's really messed up is it could be even you getting angry at them
Mhm.
about trying to deceive you. As long as you are angry, you're in their clutches. And so this is another situation where the prescriptive advice is just take a step back, give yourself an opportunity to pause. Just in a normal sales situation, so common for somebody to tell you, like, here's the deal I can offer you today. And this is special opportunity. I can't give you this price tomorrow. And you feel so excited by the conversation and the opportunity and you feel like investing or buying or committing to this thing in this moment, but always, always, always sleep on it. Please always sleep on every big decision, whether someone's trying to manipulate you or not, including some decision like you get offered a job. Please don't say yes in that moment. Sleep on it, ask if you can have more time to decide and to negotiate, things like this. But any big decision, pause, wait. In the book, I have a whole chapter on defense against the dark arts. There are 9 different red flags, and I'll only mention one other specific one because it's complicated. But another red flag is that you have a funny feeling about this person
Mm.
or you have a funny feeling about the situation. And almost always, when people have been interviewed after having been the victim of a con or a crime, they tell you that they had a funny feeling. Very, very often they ignored it. However, what's also really complicated is that social biases and prejudices give us funny feelings about
Mm.
people who are different from us. So the fact that you have a funny feeling doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with that person. And when you have a funny feeling, what it means is ask yourself, is this person trying to influence me? Is it possible that they're trying to influence me? Then that's a funny feeling that I really want to pay attention to. And I want to look for other red flags.
I had a Erin Dorsey. She was a sex trafficking victim turned
Mm,
stop being traffic project founder. And she also internationally famed model for 2 years, and then she quit because she realized fame and money worsens her self-worth. But one thing that really potent that she said I remember to this date is she says too many people don't consider why certain people are telling certain stories in certain order, right? Like, why are they telling you this? What's their intention? What's their goal? What's their objective? Because intention does matter, and then there's the impact. But I was like, yeah. And after that, I started to self examine what are the things I say to people when I first meet? What am I trying to establish? Like on the podcast, I talk about I'm pen educated because you have to have that buy in, and I'm very young looking. So that's part of the tactics I have to do. But in person, I don't say that. I don't tell people I went to Ivy League. I used to in my 20s, but in my 30s, I realized by me doing that, I'm actually putting myself in a box of being smart. That means I have to always live up to that expectations, and it's tiring because I'm a veteran. I'm good with blue languages. I don't want to always sound intellectual. I want to shoot the shit sometimes. So I no longer self-disclose that until someone asks or it comes up naturally. But I do feel like more people need to not just be intentional, but think about why are they telling me this at this exact time and this exact order, and what are they trying to achieve? Because every actions, conscious or otherwise, have an underlying intention.
then what? That's so interesting to hear you say that you don't want to introduce yourself in a way that you have to live up to.
Hmm.
And of course, you're a smart person, but you don't want to have to be smart all the time. And I definitely don't introduce myself all the time as a Yale professor. And in a personal situation, I'm just definitely not going to lead with that.
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
But I've thought that that is for because I don't want to make another person uncomfortable
Mm.
in some way. But it's also unconsciously because I don't wanna have to live up to whatever their idea is of Yale professor.
Mhm. It's
Thank
interesting
you.
you say that because, man, this is completely off the tangent, but insecurity, because that's tying with emotions. This is a struggle I'm still flushing out and I'm still learning and going through. But I struggle with a lot of insecurities by others. Like, for you said, if I tell them I went to Penn, you went to Harvard for a PhD, you went to, you teach at Yale, depending on their chapters of life and their level of comfort with themselves. That's what insecurity is. Are you comfortable in your skin the way you are? Sense of identity. Unless they have cultivated awareness, you can feel their projection. And it's not a professional hazard. You can feel it, right? They either undermine you or you can feel a change of energy, body language, and nonverbal cues. But I think about that a lot where the insecurities, and it's almost like for certain folks, it's harder for us to be truly authentic to the things we want to discuss. Sure, there's small talk and there's time and place, but I struggle with this insecurity projections and this differing level of awareness in my day to day quite often.
Yeah, and I think in this on this topic, I sometimes probably project insecurities wrongly on other people. And there's so many people who are just like, I have a job, other people have a job, and they're not going to care whatever my job is, right? But I will usually say that I'm a teacher
Mm.
when somebody asks me what my job is, but then it becomes very awkward if we're talking for a while and then it comes out later like, "Oh, you're actually a Yale professor," where it seems like I was being disingenuous, and then I'm the person who's making way too big a deal of
Mm.
whatever work it is that I do. They're not the person who is making a big deal of it. So this is gonna have me reflect.
Yeah.
Can I
Yeah.
just share something that's popped into my head
Yes,
a couple
please.
of times in this conversation where we're talking about different ways of influencing people? We talked about the path of here's the data, the information, rational reasons to take action, and here's the emotional and visceral and unconscious path. And I just want to highlight this organization that I'm a huge fan of who does this so beautifully. It's a prime example of bringing emotions into the influence process in a beautiful way. And I don't know if you know this organization, it's called Liberty in North Korea. This organization has as its purpose to help, well, in the title, to liberate North Korea, but it's really to liberate North Koreans. And a lot of the work that they do is actively helping people flee North Korea and get safely to South Korea and other places. And also, though, they do a lot of advocacy work to shift the way that people perceive North Koreans, not the North Korean regime, but North Koreans, where so many of us, not you because you have more personal experience and a different. Did you grow up in South Korea?
I spent a year there. Mhm.
You spent 1 year there. Okay. So spending time in South Korea um, versus being an outsider entirely, um, the things that I, as a curious person, will typically learn about North Koreans will be these people are brainwashed and poor and starving and to be pitied and just the most unfortunate people on earth and have no food and electricity and things like this. And I don't realize that this is a very patronizing way because I'm not thinking about it consciously, such a patronizing way to see an entire country of people who are, of course, normal people like all of the rest of us on earth. And Liberty in North Korea shares positive and inspiring stories where you get to hear all of these North Koreans talking about regular life in North Korea, where it's not consistently focused on oppression and poverty and brainwashing. They'll be talking about things like ice cream and things like, what made you happy? And these are people who have left. But it helps people like me change how we think of people from an entire nation that I was accidentally prejudiced against. And then they bring in incredible adventure stories of these escapes. And they're about to show, I think it's next week or later this week, a screening, but anybody can access this movie online, a movie called Beyond Utopia,
Mm.
which is a documentary following a couple of families who are trying in South Korea who are trying to help relatives in North Korea to escape North Korea. And it is riveting, heart pounding, tear jerking, inspiring, and it gives you all of the emotions. So it was a long tangent to say, um, if we want people to feel involved and have a shred of changing their minds, even changing their minds really often starts with touching their hearts.
Mm. Yeah, I'll include that link and information in the show notes for those who want to
Thank you.
check it out. But I think that begs the question of what is the power behind normalization of one's pain that you outline in your book beautifully.
Wow. I write about it in the book in terms of sharing suffering and experiences that we've had. You do that, I do that. And many of us experience and model vulnerability, especially in situations where we have any kind of expertise or leadership where somebody's looking up to us, right? Like you're a clinical expert, you bring this humanity that isn't this arm's length. I'm the expert. Here's everything that I've trained in. Here's what I know about the people that I'm trying to help. You bring this humanity of here's the suffering that I've experienced. And that's what gives me the empathy and the motivation to try to help other people with their suffering. I think this is a big privilege that we have
Mm.
as leaders and role models, and all of us in different contexts are leaders and role models to not be perfect and give other people permission to not be perfect and to accept that suffering is a core piece of the human experience. It just is. We can't change it. It's a deep part of the philosophy in Viktor Frankl's book, of course, in Buddhist thought. And if we accept suffering exists for us and for other people, the gift that we give other people is not being wrong or bad for suffering.
Yeah, the first noble truth in Buddhism, life is suffering. And so many people forget that humans connect over weaknesses and vulnerabilities. We don't connect over strength. Like, we don't connect about boasting about our business successes. Oh, I'm so great at X, Y, and Z. Good for you, man. But you actually create distance. And there is a famous Harvard Business School study I read years ago, talks about the biggest detractor from establishing trust is lack of vulnerability. All the leaders and managements that seem seemingly perfect on the outside and just flawless, right? People don't trust them because they feel very non-personable and they don't seem like humans, right? But unfortunately, with the fake it till you make it, now vulnerability is also a marketplace. It pains me, especially in the content world. But all that to say, humans connect over weaknesses and vulnerabilities and definitely not over strength.
It's so true, and that was something that I had to learn when I started teaching because I was insecure. So I was trying to present myself as an expert
Mm,
so that my students would think that I was credible. And I didn't understand for a long time that, first of all, if you're somebody's teacher, whatever the context is, you're probably credible, right? Like, they're looking up to you and, you're the teacher, but also that people aren't looking for credibility. We try so hard to be respected
mm,
because that's what we want. But what other people really want is to like us. And the way to like us is warmth and vulnerability. And I used to not introduce myself personally when I started my class because I didn't want the class to be about me. I just wanted the class to be about the students and about the work and about the research and the content. I thought it was going to be selfish and aggrandizing, even for me to take time at the beginning of class for me to tell them who I am. And one time in a sidebar conversation with a TA, I told him about the circumstances in which I had grown up, which were very humble. And mom was a single mom and lived with my sister in a one-bedroom apartment. She slept on the couch. I would, we just faced a lot of situations where we had less money and privilege than the people in our community. And when there were field trips at school, for example, I would stay home pretending to be sick because we couldn't afford the few dollars that it was to go on the field trips. And this student who was first gen college said that he didn't relate to me personally until that moment when I shared that I didn't come from the privileged background that he expected that I would come from by virtue of me being a white professor at Yale. And so after that conversation with him, he said, "That's what I needed to hear, and
mm.
actually needed to hear it from you in that class. We all needed to see you as a human being so that we would trust you instead of just looking up to you." And so now at the beginning of class, I will show pictures of my family and introduce myself in a personal way, not as a, "Oh, I come from this lack of privilege." That's just this tiny piece of it, but also it helps when you see my family members and you see that there are multiple colors and you see that we're goofballs and we wear silly costumes sometimes. And the same thing when I introduce TAs, I do it in a very personal way so that we get to be building this community of beautiful, complex, imperfect people.
I love podcasting and I'm almost 5 years in because we're not only breaking down the fourth dimension for the audience, but we ourselves are also engaged in this dance. I never made this connection until just now. People say windows are the portal to your soul. And I think that's because of vulnerability. When you're being in a vulnerable state, your eyes show because most of the communications are nonverbal, as you know. But I think that's so powerful because sharing vulnerable stories is not the same as being vulnerable in the moment. And that's something that for me I have to be hyper aware of as a therapist. And as a podcaster, I'm so good at sharing vulnerable stories of the past, but now I'm not always vulnerable in the moment sharing those stories because I've been primed with the practice of not telling lies but telling the stories that resonated and happened to me. But I think really feel like windows or eyes are the portals to your soul because of the vulnerability piece. And that's something I learned recently, that being vulnerable is not the same as sharing vulnerable stories.
Benoit, this is so deep, and I need to take. By the way, I'm taking a lot of notes in this conversation because there's so many things that I want to ponder and follow up on, read, look up. The idea that sharing vulnerable stories isn't the same as being vulnerable in the moment really resonates, and I want to understand it better. Can you say more about that?
So, for example, I'll share a story of mine that I shared a while ago. So, my fiance, she's a physician, and I came to LA, or we came to LA from Philadelphia. I took my career pivot from policymaking to therapy, and we knew that long distance was not an option. So I chose to give up the city I love, and I flew across country because she was going through a matchmaking process, which is very inflexible. 1 month or 1 week after we signed our lease in LA, and 1 month before we were supposed to fly out, she actually broke up with me, my fiance Becky. And long story short, that's also the reason why I quit drinking for good. I've been sober for 3.5 years, because I'm never physically violent, but I used to be verbally violent because I'm articulate and I can say things in the most hurtful ways. When I'm sober, it's less of a tendency. With my awareness, I can slow it down. You see the house burning down, so you can sort of reel back and leave the space because we have a lot of cultivated practices between us. But when you're under the influence of alcohol, when you're drunk, there's no reeling back. You see the train leaving the train station, and you see the house burning down, and you think to yourself, I hope God I can redeem this the next day. This was one too many times. So she said, no more. I don't deserve this. I deserve to be a better partner. And you don't fit that book. And we've been dating for 2.5 years at this time. So I puked for the first time. I never felt this heart wrenching feeling. When people said I feel heartsick, I never knew what they meant. I understood it intellectually, but I never had a practice because I had commitment issues growing up until her. So I vomited because I felt so sick. I felt like someone was squeezing my heart from inside out. I was on my knees. I'm a 6 foot male. I'm a veteran. I don't get on my knees until that time. And I cried. I told her, hey, I made a grave mistake. Please take me back. It will never happen again. And as a token of commitment, I will quit drinking for good. And I had a lot of underlying addictions. I was a high functioning alcoholic, as many of us are until you stop drinking. And nothing I said helped until I started crying. And that's when Becky told me that, hey, Benoit, I know you have a podcast. I know you're very articulate. You've always told vulnerable stories, just like my sexual trauma experience that were catalyzed through psilocybin healing. But she said, this is the first time in 2.5 years of knowing you that I've seen you actually being vulnerable in the moment. And that's the only reason she took me back. And now we're getting married in 2 months, 4.5 years in. So that's what happens. But that's what I really mean by, oh, there is a difference. So many of us are so good at storytelling, right? But the better we are at storytelling, we actually get very disconnected from the content of the stories we tell.
That's an amazing story, and thank you
Mhm.
for sharing it, and congratulations on your upcoming wedding. And it's also inspiring to hear her personal strength and power, and that she drew a boundary, she drew a line, and she said, I deserve better than this.
Mhm.
And how vulnerable and committed you had to be. Also, it sounds like not just in that moment for her to change her mind, but living up to your and her standards over a few years in between for her to say, like, okay, yes, still in. You're still the guy.
Mhm.
I'm still in. That difference that she highlighted between sharing vulnerable stories and being vulnerable in that moment, is it that you were vulnerable because she could hurt you, and you were asking for something that if you didn't get it was going to further break your heart?
Well, I never thought about this. I think it's both. I think it's the fear of rejections and what I could lose. And it's also the fear of further hurting. Because, like I said, I didn't understand how high stake it was emotionally until that moment. Until she said, we're done. I'm breaking up with you with all the circumstances at hand. So I think it's just like the magnitude of emotions I was feeling. But it was, I think it comes down to the thought of her leaving me for good was unbearable. And because of that, I was forced to like exhibit my fear. I was really afraid. That's why I was crying. And I think she saw that fear openly for the first time. I wasn't rationalizing it. I wasn't intellectualizing it. I was truly letting my emotions come out the way they are. And because of that, my emotions saved our marriage.
Wow. Benoit, do you think that vulnerability entails fear?
Wow. It has to be, right? Because is what is when you perceive as what is not possible on the other side, or what do you have to lose? Just like Brene Brown, the prominent researcher about vulnerability, like guilt versus shame. I don't know if she talks about this, but how can you be vulnerable if you don't have this fear, which is a primary emotion for humans? Like anger is secondary, but fear is a primary emotion. So I think vulnerability to I'm just thinking out loud for the first time, but when you're displaying vulnerability, I think you're allowing your brain to go offline and letting your primary emotion to show, which means the space between thinking and our primary instincts is diminished, which I think makes us the most human in that moment.
I've just never thought about vulnerability in this way, nor the distinction between sharing vulnerable stories and actually being vulnerable. This also helps me understand that sharing vulnerable stories can have to do with shame. Like I can share something that I'm ashamed of.
Mm,
However, I've already processed the fear, which I think is what you were talking about. You might share a story on your podcast. I'm not fearing rejection because of the context or because I've already shared this. But when the shame or something else comes along with this deep fear of rejection, that's what we're talking about as real vulnerability.
yeah.
Thank you.
I've never thought about this either. I never deconstructed to this level. But I'm definitely going to think more about that too. Is fear a intrinsic ingredient that requires or is a prerequisite to vulnerability? Um, See, this is why I love these conversations. It's breaking down my own walls, and this is awesome. Um, but speaking of the, I guess, reality breaking moments, because for me, the breakup was reality breaking for me. And because of that, I took ownership. I did a lot of different things to live up to the promise I made, but also to ensure that the relationship is growing. Because as you know, not just in business, but in life, if you're not working actively towards problems, the problems will find you. As I tell my patients, right? If you don't choose your addiction, like for me, it's working out, right? A lot of certain different things. If you're not actively choosing your addictions, addictions will find you. Um, Zoe, can you recall any of maybe powerful reality breaking moments from your combination of research or just experimental learning from writing this book or otherwise?
I'm writing that down really quickly. If you're not choosing addictions, addictions will find
Yeah.
you. This is one that is not specifically personal and vulnerable, but it's very present for me in this moment
Mm,
today because it was a conversation I had yesterday where I was in more or less your shoes. I was interviewing an author, and I'll show you the book that we were talking about was this book called The Future of the Responsible Company.
mm,
The author is Vincent Stanley, and he is a founding member and chief storyteller of Patagonia. And I care so deeply about the climate and sustainability, and a lot of the work that I do at Yale, but especially around the world in other places, is helping people who are working on the climate to try to be more influential
mm,
in their work so that we can save the planet, because I believe very strongly in this existential crisis. I took sustainability as a frame for granted because it's so widely used. And of course, doing something sustainably is good. But the challenge that Vincent Stanley was laying out in this book and his conversation with me is that actually business is not sustainable. Business ultimately is going to be extractive and because of how business works, it has to be profitable. And public companies have to grow. But at the very least, a business has to be profitable. And so, in some sense, they're taking more than they give.
Mm.
And that is not sustainable. But if you change the paradigm from sustainability to responsibility, that is incredibly empowering because it asks you to step back and say, what is the harm that I'm causing? What is the harm being caused by all of the business practices going on around me that contribute to my business? And how can I take responsibility for fixing some of those problems and helping fix some of those problems, even if I don't have direct ownership of it? So, say maybe it's my suppliers and their employee practices and they're exploiting labor in another country. I don't own the factory, but what if I took responsibility for the experience of the people who are working in those factories and building the products that I'm selling? Or the way that Patagonia started was as a company that was selling very specific metal tools for alpine climbers. And they realized that the tools that they were selling were harming the rocks and they were putting cracks in the mountains that they were climbing. And so they changed their whole business model and they actively influenced the climbing world to change how people were climbing, to use a different kind of equipment that didn't create and then expand the cracks in the rocks and degrade the mountains. And it moved me because who takes responsibility for the harm that we're causing the rocks? It's not, it wasn't Patagonia's problem, but Patagonia could take responsibility for that. And Patagonia is just a great example of a company who's taken responsibility for all kinds of things that they didn't have ownership of. And I'm still processing it, but I'm thinking about myself, not just in an organization, but as a human being. And what harm is being caused by all of the people and products and processes that are a part of my life that could take greater responsibility for. And it starts with eliminating the veils of self deception to be open to seeing and admitting what harm is being caused and what harm am I causing.
Mm. That reminds me of a concept I was talking about recently, responsibility versus reaction. I think a lot of people, like when you're responding to something, when you're reacting to something, people use those two terms very loosely. But if you think about and if you really deconstruct what they are, reaction is reactive, it's subconscious. You're reacting to the circumstance that's unfolding. When you're responding, it's more conscientious. You're taking ownership of making a choice. And that's what responsibility is. It's response. You're choosing to respond in a way that aligns and resonate with your values. And I think more of us need to be respond more and react less, which comes as awareness, emotions, logic, and our ability to, yeah, just lie to ourselves less. Because that's the only way you can respond in a aligning way with your values.
Wow. Thank you. I wrote that one down cool as well. And that aligns with a book that I feel like you probably would have read called Extreme Ownership by former Navy SEAL Jocko. What
Oh,
is his
Jocko
last
Willings.
name?
Yeah.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes. Where he's writing essentially about taking responsibility for things that weren't your job. But if you see yourself as having ownership, which in his paradigm is the same as responsibility, then it doesn't matter who ultimately caused the problem. You can be the person to take responsibility for the solution. So he's writing about it from an individual perspective, and then Vincent Stanley is writing about this from an organizational perspective.
Yeah. I mean, Patagonia is such a great company. I believe they're the first company that implemented mandatory breaks like surfing for, I think, an hour or 2 hours. But research shows that your productivity skyrockets, right? Because like routine creates productivity, but novelty inspires. So I love that company for so long. It's such a great company, great mission, and they walk the walk and talk the talk.
Yeah. Yeah, they're fantastic. I don't wanna have a boss, but if I did, I wouldn't mind working there.
Okay, so I want to be respectful of your time, but I have a few more questions to go. This is kind of me asking you to peel back your cognitive processing and kind of go back. Do you have any concepts in influence or behavioral change that you used to believe in, but no more?
I'm sure that I have so many. Let me just ponder for a moment. I've actually taught some sessions on myths of behavioral science and with the lens of being skeptical about really not just behavioral science, but scientific research and findings in general. And there are so many studies that are famous in behavioral science that have turned out to just not be valid.
Hmm.
And maybe it's because there was some fraud, like we've talked about before. Maybe it's just because they didn't replicate. So it was legitimate studies, but it was just kind of a fluke. And maybe it was because there was some fussing around. And I think the most impactful one for me to find out about gives me a lot of hope about humanity. And this was the Stanford prison experiment.
Oh,
So,
I was just thinking about that.
right.
That's crazy.
Okay. Yeah. So anybody who's taken an undergrad psychology class has probably learned about Phil Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, where it was essentially looking at the question of why were Nazis so evil and could normal people become evil easily because of systems of power. So they brought people in, and these are Stanford students. So they create a prison, and I think the experiment is supposed to run over the course of a week. A lot of your listeners will have known about this, so just very briefly for people who are not familiar, there are participants in the experiment designated to be prisoners, participants who are designated to be the guards, and what they are testing is if we don't give the guards any guidance about what it looks like to be a guard, will they start abusing the prisoners? And the study famously had the guards become so abusive that they had to cut off the study halfway through and they couldn't even finish the experiment because guards were humiliating the prisoners. They were dehumanizing the prisoners. I don't think that they were allowed to be actively physically abusing them, but maybe this was doing things like keeping them up late
Making
and
noises. Yep.
not letting them sleep. Yeah. So the findings of the Stanford prison experiment were supposedly showing that humanity has so much latent evil in it that it takes just barely a nudge to push us over the edge to become evil and abusive when we have power over people who are weak. That is a very important thing to say about humanity. It turns out this study was essentially bullshit. And really, what happened was they designed this in a very media savvy way. And they were coaching the prison guards along, they were coaching the guards to be evil and abusive. And there's now this trove of firsthand data that researchers, and there's been a whole book about it and everything, have been able to go back and look through, finding that they orchestrated this scenario with the intention always of cutting it off in the middle. And it was never designed to see, are people mean? It was designed to see, can we show that people are mean by coaching them to be mean, which is what they did. So, what get out of this is actually there's not this latent, easily accessible, deep, putrid, dark pool of evilness within us. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I'm going to interview a Scott Hershowitz, another author from your authors group, actually tomorrow, and we're gonna talk about philosophy of good and evil,
Oh,
because there
cool.
are so many different branches of beliefs, right? So but it is interesting and it's crazy. I love when group flow happens. As I was asking that question, that's one of the study I was thinking about, because a lot of people still don't know about it, and
Yeah.
print
The
PI.
second part of it.
Exactly. And the principal
Right.
investigator, I believe he was awarded a really prestigious award and they had to take it back.
I didn't know they took it back. He's been awarded all kinds of prestigious awards, testified at Congress,
Yep.
and he's been a hero of mine. So this was personally disappointing in that way because I really liked him, but at a deeper human and spiritual level, thank God. And also, while we're talking about this, one more study that lots of listeners will be familiar with is the bystander effect.
Mm,
And this was a study where Kitty Genovese was a woman who was brutally murdered in Central Park. There's also been documentaries about this. And and notoriously there were bystanders who did nothing about this while they heard her screams for an hour or so, and it was really awful. And it turns out that, first of all, bystanders were actively trying to intervene, and there were multiple people doing things to try to help this person that they heard. So that whole story was fabricated. I don't know of I'm not saying that the people who did research, so Batson and Darley, who did follow up research, weren't doing reasonably good research, but the best research that's been done is recently, a few years ago, there was an analysis of closed circuit television in multiple cities in the multiple countries in the world where there's so much big data on what goes on, for example, outside bars late at night where fights sometimes happen. And they found, in absolute contrast to some research that has experimentally been set up to have people not intervene, that in real life, where nobody's trying to do any experiment, 90% of the time in which strangers could intervene in a situation like a fight where somebody was in danger, 90% of the time the bystanders do intervene.
mm.
So this was another study that said humans aren't reliably good. And that study essentially said we're amoral and we'll just sit back and watch atrocities happen. And the real life findings are no, actually, people are very inclined to be helpful, even though in these situations they were all risking their own personal safety. So it's a huge deal to have intervention in a physical fight. And even in those situations, people step up.
One of the most fascinating guests I had on, his name is Mathieu Ricard. He's a French Buddhist monk, but he used to be a molecular scientist. He trained over a Nobel laureate, but after he got his PhD, he booked a one-way flight to Himalayas, and I was part of his book tour. But he co-authored one of the most prominent books in altruism. He actually proved that altruism is real, and there is such thing as pure altruism without any return. The research is out there, but that's a case in point I sort of thought about. Um, I
What's his book, Benoit?
oh man, he
I'll look it up.
yeah, but just Matthew Ricard's something about altruism.
Thank you.
A lot limited information. Uh, but that's the because I do want to ask you a very personal question because I can sense this very very powerful and potent underlying theme of optimism from you, right? Because you talked about hopes a lot and humanity a lot. There's a famous quote that says, realists are often right, but optimists change the world. But my question is, why is it worth and why do we need or must stay optimistic despite the cost of disappointment, heartache, and getting let down?
I think the answer to your question is in the essence of the quote that you just mentioned, that if we are not dreaming of something even better and ideally bigger than what we already have, we just won't be taking the action toward those possibilities. And there's so many situations in which the dream that you have is very, very, very unlikely to succeed, but it's absolutely the right path to try. So if you were behaving like a realist and just saying like, "Oh, there's a 99% chance that this is not actually going to happen," you wouldn't put your energy toward it. But it's still the right thing to do this when you can, when you have an opportunity. And this only happens when you're willing to be optimistic and dream big. I would rather fail trying than succeed not trying. And honestly, I feel myself getting a little bit teary. I believe that the climate is a situation like this that we're talking about right now. So I do not, if I'm trying to be realistic, what I see in the future is horrifying and it's so scary. And for so many years will be a world that I don't want my daughter and hopefully her children and their children to live in. And we're on this path that capitalism has put us on. I don't see us undermining capitalism. And so I really don't see us taking any giant steps off that path until the reality for billions of people in the world is so horrible that it forces us to, because it's changed the incentives for the power structures, the people in the organizations in this world that have the power. And yet, I believe that putting my energy toward trying to help people solve this crisis, which isn't inevitable, it's just very likely. I believe that this is the best thing that I can do with my energy. And I try to be realistic with myself about the very, very, very small chance that we have of fixing things before they get terrible. But why would I want to do anything else other than try?
Yeah. Thank you for um, being vulnerable. Right. Once again, it's because you're acknowledging the fear, and yeah, it is pretty. Yeah, it's climate action and climate crisis, as you outline in the book, is one of those darker topics that I feel like we're losing traction because the marketing and a lot of things you talked about in the book. But I do really feel like, once again, going back to what I told Josh, my mentee, right? Actions create opportunities. And we can't just wait in our home at the comfort of our couches, waiting for the opportunities to, it's like lottery or finding your significant other. You have to do something about it, right? Like you're not gonna find the magical soulmates knocking on your door. You have to put yourself out there. But my favorite quote.
Benoit,
Mhm.
um, because you brought up a sweet topic, and thank you for shifting us here. Can I just invite you to share, if you feel like it, how you met your fiance?
How I met my fiance.
Yeah.
Oh, we met on Hinge. It's it.
So you were putting yourself out there.
Oh yeah, it was. Well,
Yeah.
the biggest fear I had to move through for my fiance isn't the avenue of how we met, but letting go of my fear of commitment and willing to decondition and unlearn some of the patterns they were serving to me. Because I used to do a lot of one night stands and just no commitment until I realized it's no longer serving me. So that was the biggest thing. And telling her I love you was the hardest part I've done because I've never said it before. So it was not in my practice. But thankfully, I'm very introspective and I took a lot of things to do that. But it's like even tying that to climate crisis that you're talking about. Honestly, it's some of the most rewarding, gratifying things I've done, with the biggest rewards are the ones I didn't think was possible. I didn't think it was possible for me to get married because I had commitment issues from my single mother household, which is similar like to you. I never had any success case studies in my life that show me that love is possible. Right? I don't believe in soulmates. I think that's very lazy. It takes away your ownership. If you believe in predestined half, right? I don't think soulmates are. It's. I think it's one of the stupidest ideas out there. I think you have to create your love. Once you work on it, you just work at it, despite the highs and lows. But yeah, my marriage is one of the shining examples at climate crisis. It was bleak for me given my experiences, but when I did something about it, it was beautiful and very grateful to be in this position.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I do believe in soulmates, but in a different way than it usually gets discussed.
Mm.
And I feel like when my soul chooses
Mm.
on a spiritual realm, when my soul chooses my partner, which it I didn't realize that I hadn't done it before. I'm actually on my third marriage now. Um, and this is the first time that I really get to be committed from the depths of my soul
Mm.
and recognizing my partner in his soul and his spirit and saying, this is this is the profound depth at which I choose to be with you. And so I do believe that he's my soulmate, but it's not just that he was randomly determined by the universe. It was definitely the two of us choosing that.
Responsibility, right? You
Yeah.
chose to make an action about it.
Yeah.
Um, so, like I said, I have so many more questions, but I do want to be respectful. I want to conclude today's conversation with the way you concluded your book. You concluded your book by saying that while the study of influence is a science, the practice of influence is an art. Can you bring us home with that question?
When people want to know how to implement the influence techniques that I teach and that I write about, and we've talked about just a couple of them in this conversation. In the book, Influence is Your Superpower, it goes through very tactically lots of those. I appreciate that you haven't asked me to just like one, two, three, four, five teach these things because I've learned a lot in this conversation myself and really enjoyed it. The idea that's kind of frustrating when people put into practice is that influence is context based and it varies from person to person, context to context. And so it's all an organic experiment. And so, whatever I can teach you is something that you practice with and you experiment and you try it and you see how it goes and you make it work for you. So, you, Benoit, and I, Zoe, will have different influence styles as we go out into the world. And we will and we also have different influence styles that work better for each of us. So there are plenty of things that are universal and then plenty of things that are person and context specific. So the art of it is the experimentation and what I see as mastery along a path of influence, that masters are artists
Mm,
and they have wisdom that comes from experience instead of experts who have developed expertise through knowledge. Real masters have developed wisdom through their experiments, their triumphs, their failures. So, my goal is to help people become wise on this path of mastery that also never ends. Like, masters would just continue to try to learn small things to tweak to get a little bit better day by day. And we always have a lot to learn from each other. But, like, really, this conversation has been such a pleasure for me because I've learned a lot from you, and you've also gotten a lot of wheels turning in my mind. So I appreciate that you create these deep conversations. And my friend Todd Cashton, who was on your show recently, had said, he texted me right after, and he said, that was one of the best podcast conversations I've ever had. And yeah, likewise, Todd, I'm texting you right after this.
no, thank you for the digital flowers. And yeah, I think more people need to have these conversations, right? The polarity, the burning down political landscape we're in, especially this year, the primary season, the lack of attention for climate crisis and other societal ills. Societal ills are not people, but they do comprise of people, right? Especially in LA, the pervasive homelessness and a lot of situations going on. And I do feel like one of the most effective way of exerting influence is having a conversation about it without that selfish lens. But yeah, I learned a lot, and your humilities are inspiring. You taking notes and given your experience and expertise and wisdom, I do feel like humility is important. I spoke with Todd about this. Curiosity is a prerequisite to humility. Or no, sorry, humility is a prerequisite to curiosity. Because for me
Yeah.
to have you on, I have to internalize and accept the fact that I have a lot to learn from you, which I do, and many others like Todd and other people before me. But the most visual analogy that Matthew Ricard, the French Buddhist, that shared with me is I asked him, like, how come some of the wisest people I respect are the most humble people? He laughed and he said, well, Benoit, if you look at a fruit tree, empty fruit trees without fruits, their branches go high up. It's like head, shoulders, right, chins up, but they have nothing. But fruitful fruit trees, their branches are heavy and they're lowered. They bow down because of the heaviness of the knowledge and wisdom they have. And I was like, holy crap. Because the more we know, the more we know nothing. But some of the most ignorant people, in the people that I know, it's not a diss, it's just lack of exposure, different timeline, different chapters. they tend to be the most confident in what they do not know. So I do feel like humility is required. And yeah, I learned a lot from you today, seriously.
I love that frame of the fruit trees. Thank you.
Yeah, I love visual things. With that being said, this is where I roll out the metaphorical red carpet. So, with your book, anything you want to share, where can people check you out and dive a lot deeper into all the behavioral changes and influence research and tactics that's evidence based and scientifically based?
Thank you so much. So the book is called Influence is Your Superpower, and the easiest way to find it is on Amazon. I invite, though, anyone who wants to connect with me, the easiest way to do that, if you're on LinkedIn, is just to find me, Zoe Chance, on LinkedIn. I do have a website, and you can find me there also. But I love meeting like minded people and connecting with folks who have a similar kind of mission as you and I do to help people thrive and just make the world a better place, one person or one conversation at a time. So thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, appreciate your time. But the last thing I would say is we are in the era of loneliness epidemic, especially for a lot of men. Loneliness is real. It is the biggest killer in 2024. It's equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, according to US Surgeon General. And I think the only way to combat loneliness epidemic is to have conversations, be stay curious, stay humble, but also willing to influence others in a positive way that everybody wins and we can achieve this win-win-win scenario that you talked beautifully about in your book. With that being said, I appreciate your time today, Zoe.
Thank you, Benoit. Such a pleasure.
And to all the listeners, if you have made it till this end, thank you so much. As you know, the most competitive commodity of 2024 is attention. I hope you took away something from amazing conversation with Zoe, and I urge you to discover more whatever topics that piqued your interest from today's conversation. And if you can share this episode with one friend, it's free for you, but priceless for the podcast's growth. And as always, I hope you come back next week's train of Discover More and choose curiosity over fear. Thank you for discovering more with us, me and Zoe. Thank you.